Tell us about Cambridge.
Well, I think the great thing about going to university is, mine was lucky enough to be Cambridge, by some squeak, is that you can choose, A, your friends, and B, your interests, in a way that you can't do in life until that stage, really, if you've been to school where your friends are your people around you in a smaller group, and you do what you're told, by and large. So I found it a very liberating time of one's life, and I took the advice of my wonderful art master, who was my favourite master at school, glory in the name of the art master, Mr. Drew, Graham Drew, and he just said, just before I left over some civilised glass of wine or something, he said, just whatever you do, have the courage to follow what you want to do. Just bite your lip and do it, because it'll be a bit daunting. And he said, if you want to get into the theatre world, which I think you do, just go for it. So that's what I chose to do, and it was a bit daunting, because it is, any new environment's daunting, and but I was lucky because in the end I managed to befriend and get to work with a lot of very talented people, many of whom are still my friends, and from Bennett-Jones and Douglas Adams and Nick Heitner I shared a house with, Jimmy Mulville, who runs Hat Trick Productions, Peter Fincher, who ran ITV and BBC One. So there were a lot of, and many, many more actually. And so you can you get in with like-minded people, you do things, you've got a theatre to run, you've got the Footlights to go and tour with. It was fantastic. And in a way, my law degree sort of receded as my theatre work increased.
And obviously in this environment, a lot of work with the Footlights, but you found yourself up for election for president of the Footlights against Nick Heitner. How did that one go?
Yeah, well, no, president of the Amateur Dramatic Club, actually, which had its own theatre, the wonderful thing at Cambridge. You have a student theatre that is actually run by the students. It had a professional manager to make sure the building didn't fall down, but the programming and the financing and everything was run by a student committee. And it's elected, and there's one senior member, but it's elected, and I went head-to-head with Nick Heitner, and rather embarrassingly, ever since, beat him. That's only because I used to buy people beers in the bar, and he was busy working, frankly. I think I was very glad to serve under him, is the way I consider it at the National Theatre, where you were very involved in subsequent years. Yeah, but he was very talented then, and he was very talented now.
What do you think distinguished the people at Cambridge who had talent, but some of them obviously went on and realised it, and others didn't? You probably think of several people who were very talented, but whose subsequent career never really happened in the way that it did for the people you've been talking about.
Well, in a way, a bit of its luck comes into it, but I think it's much easier if you're responsible for creating your own work.
Right.
Than if I think it's really tough for actors, because there are a lot of extremely good actors and only a fairly limited amount of work, and they don't have control over that work. And it's often a lucky break. If you're in a good series, which has nothing to do with you as an actor, you're cast, whether it's good or bad, I mean, you can choose whether to do it or not. Whereas I think with writers, be they novelists or be they writer-performers, comedians, who I work with a lot, you control your own destiny to a large extent. So, I got to know, although he wasn't an exact contemporary, but we were good friends from early on, and he directed the first May Week Footlights Review I was involved with, that Douglas Adams, who was, I would describe, a genius. I don't use that word often. But he was a very agonized writer and an absolute bugger for deadlines, but he just had a special creative writing talent. And I think the poor people who didn't make it, who were very talented and some enjoyed some success, have just been, on the whole, by and large, a bit unlucky as actors.
Because it's interesting, because I met a cousin of Camilla's, a guy called Cog McLean, and Cog did a lot of acting at Cambridge and was very much on a par with Griff Rhys-Jones, but he never took the next step.
Yeah, but Griff was always a writer and a producer.
Right.
So, you know, and he got to work for the BBC and you know, and I think there are other examples of people who were so good and multi-talented they were never going to be anything but successful. I think there are those, you know, I think Laurie and Fry and Emma Thompson.
Robert Bathurst?
Yeah, Robert was, you know, well, I've never seen him lucky because he's bloody good, but he has had some very nice roles and he's done extremely well, you know.
But I suppose we're talking about luck as opposed to not finding the right person to manage their talent.
Well, I mean,
or wouldn't that have made the difference really for any of them? I mean, if any of them.
No, I think with acting, it can. No, it certainly can. You know, because you can help create the luck, or the opportunities, not the luck, the opportunities. And I think that you know, the role of a manager or agent is to do that, to facilitate, to help, to package, to put people together, you know, and put writers together with actors and directors and designers and so on. That is the producing and or, you know, agent art. So I think, but you can't succeed without total application, as well as the talent and a sort of an obsessive quality about you. But, you know, Simon McBurney or something like that comes to mind, you know, totally brilliant, eccentric, but obsessive. You need to be that, and then you just need to plow away. I mean, you do create your own luck, so I do think you can, you know, especially if you're somebody of that ilk, you know, who's a writer, performer, director, you know, you can...
That can get you there. But it's always been fascinating because when you first went to the Edinburgh Fringe, you were there taking productions up, and now you go up there to look at productions and to try and identify particularly people in the writer comedy side. How has it changed over that period? I mean, obviously you've seen both sides of the stage.
I mean, I had a very lucky break going to Edinburgh, actually. It's 1976, summer of 1976, and I had a choice of actually, funny, I was meant to be being a judge's marshal here in Oxford, funny enough, on the very famous murder case of, I think the Yorkshire Ripper, was he called? Or, anyway,
Peter Sutcliffe.
Yeah, the Peter Sutcliffe trial.
What's a judge's marshal? I'm sorry, ignorance.
You are basically his companion for the trial. So you sit in the court and you have dinner with him. And it's usually in those days, I mean, I knew the judge called Bill Mars-Jones. His son, Adam Mars-Jones.
He's a great novelist.
He's a very talented, again, very brilliant novelist and journalist. And anyway, you know, I knew Bill Mars-Jones from my sort of Welsh connections, and I was studying law, and he said, well, come and be my marshal. And then I got offered to manage the Footlights summer tour, and I thought, well, that'd be more fun in the end. Anyway, I think it probably was, because Adam took the job, actually. Adam did it, and he wrote his first short story they're called Lantern Lectures. It's one of 3 short stories about that trial. And it was an intense heat wave. And this terrible creep of a man in the dock for weeks on end. But anyway, I went to Edinburgh, and it was a lucky break there. I didn't have to see human depravity in a dock. I was doing a 9 o'clock show with the Footlights, with Heitner and all these guys, and Jimmy Mulville, and at 10:30 the Oxford Review was on, and I thought, well, we had a pretty good show, but I used to stay behind and watch the Oxford Review. I said, God, blimey, we're good. These people are really good. And that was Rowan Atkinson and Richard Curtis. So, and I thought, crikey, I'm going to stay close to those boys. And
You did.
I have done. Yeah. So, but that, you know, but you make your own luck. If one hadn't gone, you wouldn't have met them. But you know, and that was a very nice way of getting into Edinburgh. And you know, and I've been every year since, actually. Funny enough.
Only because you mentioned heat waves. Would that be 76 then?
76. Yeah.
So I'm delighted you say that was when that particular generation of the review came thing. Half of my favourite plays were written in 1976, sort of Robert Holman plays and David Hare plays that I really, really love. And I think for some reason there's some kind of I don't know. One day, if I ever get my head together, I'll do a PhD. There's a lot of good art from 1976, and it's really special. Peter Gills played Small Change Happened, and Robert Holmes played German Skerries, and David Hess played Fan Shen. Got
Shen,
done.
I remember Fan Shen. Yeah.
Either because it was hot or because the 60s were out, or I don't know, some interesting thing that happens that means that 1976 is a really great year. And punk.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
And,
the Clash,
you know,
yeah.
sorry to forget the big one, but, you know, there's a sort of weird year where everything's amazing. I don't know why.
Yeah, punk passed me by a bit, but and I think the National Theatre in its South Bank environment was properly up and running. You know, it got really, and in a way, with more plays being put on and getting written, they were getting, you know, that sort of production than ever was possible when they were in the old vehicle before it existed. So I think it was a timing thing, really.
And there was a sort of hand-on of satire from that sort of wound up with the 9 o'clock news that had started with things like the Froster Report and Round the Horn and Monty Python. And you felt there was a sort of, you know, a shifting through, so that there were always people coming through in that space. And 76 again. It was sort of, you were beginning to get that slightly anarchic humour coming through.
It was fun, didn't it?
But that's interesting. And when you go back now, would you say that that there isn't quite the same concentration of talent in collective shows, and most of the talent is one person writer performers?
Well, I think the big difference
have I
now
missed
is it's
it?
become an industry in itself. It's almost become professionalised. So it's actually quite difficult to go and find new talent there because they've already been signed up when they were 14 or something. You know, it's a bit like, you know, these kids at Eton who are signed up by agents when they're just performing, you know, whatever. And so, I mean, it is still possible, but now it's more a place. It's a showcase place, really, and people love.
So you're taking people there.
Yeah, we take
your
usually
people are
between
going there
20 and 30 acts, but then I'll go and see those or some of those, and just look around for new, interesting, you know, shows and people. On the whole, you know, there's a huge preponderance of single stand-up, but there are other shows, there's sketch shows, there are plays, which used to be much more play-orientated.
Yeah.
Oxford had a very distinguished series of plays going on in the 70s, and I remember trying to think, but some very good actors, Philip Franks and various people emerging through that. And they get properly reviewed, but you go get national reviews and get yourself on the map. It was great.
Yeah. No, that was remarkable, really, in terms of period. And I guess that, you know, those people just getting sort of picked up, and 1 minute Alan Bennett say, you know, a would-be Don in Exeter College, Oxford, and next minute, you know, he's an established playwright. I mean, things could move very quickly.
Yeah. Well, there is another genius.
When you were in that moment, what part of the theatre did you want to be in? I always think it's interesting, the journey people take through the different, you know, the different ideas of what you do.
I mean, a bit of a mixture. You know, there's always a comedy element because of the people I was working with, but you know, what I would call regular plays.
As a director, as
No,
a
as a
performer,
producer, and I have a chum called, who's still my best buddy, called Andre Dzerzhinsky, and he lives outside Oxford. He's a theatre producer still. It's a very precarious way of making a living, and so so we'd taken Shakespeare, we toured Shakespeare around America for a couple of years, which was a hell of an experience. Then he went off to Sheffield Crucible. I did the Bubble Theatre in London. Gary Oldman, actually, Oscar winner. He was bloody tricky then. I think he's probably bloody tricky now, but anyway, he was very good then.
Where was London Bubble based then? I've rehearsed there.
It was a mobile. It was
it? Okay.
Yeah, so you had these huge tents and you put them up in parks in London and then it was a summer season thing.
Yeah.
I did that for a couple of years, and I did a version of it in Hong Kong as well for a few months, and then in the Far East, taking shows, putting them on in different spaces. That was called Chung Ying, which is half Chinese, half English, so that was quite an experience. And then we came back, and then we set up a little theatre, commercial theatre business. It's slightly undercapitalised, I might say. We used to camp out at the Roundhouse and earn our keep by doing the get-ins and get-outs at the Roundhouse. And Thelma Holt gave us space, and we just tried to build a bit, put plays on.
I was Thelma's assistant for a year, and she told me a good story about Rowan Atkinson moving into the car park of the Roundhouse
That's right.
in a caravan, but not telling her about it. But she spotted him going home each day, and so she said to me at the end of the day one day, she went over to the caravan and in her Chanel lipstick wrote, "Whose fucking caravan is this?" on the side of it. And the next morning at sort of 8 a.m, Rowan Atkinson came in with a bottle of vodka for a looking very sorry. I was going to tell you, which I thought was fascinating, that sort of, the Roundhouse was an amazing place, I think. It had an amazing energy.
She was an amazing woman, and is an amazing woman. Yeah. It was great. And there was a lot of interesting stuff going on there then. I remember seeing Vanessa Redgrave in this, in some Chekhov, Lady of the Sea. Is that Chekhov? Yes. Or,
Ibsen, yeah.
Ibsen. And Peter Brook, I remember seeing the Eek, and then the Ken, the Great Fringe, Ken Campbell.
Yes, sorry.
Did a lot of work in the smaller space in the Roundhouse, and he did the Warp. Jim Broadbent was heavily involved in that sort of stuff, among other people. Chris Langham, poor fellow, got into trouble, but very talented guys. And they did one show that lasted 24 hours, and that was quite an epic thing to have to work on. But it was a very vibrant place.
And is it when Charles Marovitz was there as well? Was that happening then, or?
I don't recall that.
Okay.
And then we did that for a while. And then we plonked ourselves in a little office in Soho. And I've never moved out, actually.
Did that sort of morph into Tiger Aspects, really?
Well, no, we did that for 10, best part of 10 years, I suppose, a bit less than that. And I thought it's a very precarious way of making a living, especially if you're, in your 20s or whatever, putting on plays and trying to raise the money and from scratch. So, but Andre, all power to him, soldiered on. Yeah, and I got involved because we shared a thing with Mel Smith and Griffith Jones, set up Talkback, which is a vibrant TV company now. We started as a radio production business, actually. And so we did radio, I was doing that TV, and then I actually thought I'd do my own thing and set up Tiger, so that's in the mid-'80s, and my agency. So, and I'd learned the trade a bit by running a little corporate filming business to work out which end of a camera was which, and editing and that sort of thing. Yeah, it was all a bit, I mean, you could either call it haphazard or entrepreneurial, I don't know, a bit of both.
It has to be entrepreneurial because it doesn't sound like you had any government handouts or regular wages anywhere along the line.
And there was none of those. Nice dad, generous parents.
I'm always interested, television as well is sort of similar to theatre in that it is sort of all on tick. There's no actual sort of money at any, I mean, you know what I mean, but none of them.
Correct.
And when I started going around doing the generals, you think you're meeting, the brand, and actually you're meeting people who sort of haven't got any cash and need projects to be able to go cap in hand to get that. And that's sort of, it's so fascinating how very, very entrepreneurial that world is, how much they need to generate just to keep the heating on.
Particularly theatre. Theatre is that's why when I said precarious, because you're good at selling tickets. Television is much less risky, actually, because you get paid a fixed fee for doing something on the whole. And it doesn't really make a huge difference if a million people watch it or 10 million people watch it. It makes a bit of difference, but not a huge difference. Whereas the theatre makes all the difference. And you got billionaire Cameron McIntosh at one end of the tree, and most people scrabbling around in second-hand Saabs in the the other end of the pile.
And I think that's probably something that's going to be quite important for some of the intended audience in terms of not having too high a level of expectation of what the first few steps involve and how they'll be paid and how they'll live for some time as they get established. Because it seems to me all too often people have an example of that one in a million person that went sort of straight from Oxford or Cambridge to TV and then to Hollywood. But I mean, that, that's the exception, not the rule. And many of the people you've been talking about did have to come through really quite slowly over a long period of time.
Yeah, I think immediate success. I mean, it happens with rock bands,
Okay.
but it doesn't really happen with very often.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult if you're a child star to convert to being. I mean, Jamie Bell's done it pretty well, actually, to be fair. But quite often it's difficult to move from being a child star to being a star adult actor. I mean, you can do different things. There was a fantastic comedy producer who originally did he was the one person who commissioned Mr. Bean when I couldn't get any interest in it, called John Howard Davis, who'd done all the Pythons, and he had been head of comedy at BBC, and then he went to ITV, and he'd been a child star in the David Lean films in Oliver and stuff in the 60s, I suppose, but changed to become a very distinguished comedy producer and TV executive. So it can happen, but I think on the whole, people, it's a slow burn. And then some people, their talent just hits very quickly. I mean, actually, Douglas Adams was an example of that. He was the first person I knew, apart from Simon Rattle, who I'd been at early school with in Liverpool, who became suddenly very famous. You were opening your newspapers, and there they were, big interviews with them when you were 21 or 22 or something.
But Rattle's interesting because he's also an interesting example of what a nightmare it is to do so well so young, because you've got to keep running organisations for 40 years. He's been running one organisation after another. The work the guy's had to do. And
he doesn't have to do it. He must like to.
No, he must. You're right. You're right. But it's an extraordinary thing to sustain.
Yeah, of course, you don't realise then. When I was 7 or 8. And you didn't realise these people are prodigies. You just think, oh, he can do that. I can't do that. I remember I think it was probably his 8th birthday party. Where you do this thing and you get take presents, and he got given his present was a drum kit from his parents, who were in the import-export business, and so lots of presents for us as well. It was great. And he unpacked this drum kit and set it up. This was 1962-3 Liverpool, so it's quite a good place to be. And he just sat down and just played to the Beatles, as though he was born to it.
Having opened the present and...
Yeah, he just could do it, and I'd lost touch with him. We had a joint 17th birthday party together, actually, in Liverpool Bluecoat Chambers. He went to school in Liverpool, I went away somewhere else, and so I kept in touch, and then I just followed his firmament after that. And he's an amazing figure, and, by the time he was within a few years, he was one of the most famous conductors on the planet.
Do you think some of the people whose talent you've managed, do you think with some of them that development role has kind of been a joint exercise in that they needed shaping and you were there to help them shape their talent?
Yeah, the talent always comes first,
Right. No, if they don't have it, then there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, I mean, but obviously you would hope so. Yeah, but it is in a more, I would say, the key elements you can bring to it, apart from a facilitating and a sort of supportive role, is and it applies less for a novelist than it does for more collaborative arts. It's partnerships. It's putting Simon McBurney together with Lenny Henry, say,
right,
to do a show, and then you'll get a show out of Lenny that even surprises him.
Yeah.
Because and so I think if you and of course with the making of television and film, that's fundamental. So if the things that have been most high impact, the things that I've been involved with, and I don't really distinguish between producer and agent on this, but Billy Elliot, was Stephen Daldry, totally brilliant guy, but also brilliant writer in the shape of Lee Hall, and then that gets, a beautifully made film, to the wonderfully important film at the time with Paul Greengrass and a writer called Guy Hibbert, who's friend of mine who I toured America with, about the bombings in Omar. Very, grim subject, with the cooperation of the victims or the surviving relatives, and in which we actually named the bombers at the end of the program, who'd been allowed to get away with, leading to private prosecutions, and 2 of them getting done because they'd seemingly had a deal done with them to avoid prosecution. So, you know, but that was, again, an example of working with a community, with a brilliant, brilliant director in the shape of Paul Greengrass. One of those, he actually co-wrote that and somebody else directed it, and Guy Hibbert, and just that sort of chemistry, cocktails you can put together. But I think it's a much more lonelier job if you're a novelist.
But, I mean, Barney's journey has been fascinating because obviously he was initially, well, wrote plays.
Or playwright, yeah.
And then really the thing that catapulted Barney's career forwards was the first novel. And the first novel obviously sold very well, but it also was what got Barney in front of the two Nicks for the Bridge Theatre.
Right.
To write the new play that's going on next in the Rep there.
Oh, amazing.
So it's kind of so from that point of view, you know, would you say that was a typical or atypical journey through being able to do both? I suppose is a fairly unusual.
Yeah, but I think literary agency is a different game. You know, by and large, I find it a very civilized world. World of literary agency, very clever people, working with very clever people. And that guidance...
Having to stay very calm about very long lead times,
Correct.
delivery dates, planning around.
And I find it, you know, publishing as well, by and large, despite all the sort of industrialization of it, a civilized people by civilized people, much better, much nicer world than television, for example, in those terms. But I think, you know, and you speak better for yourself here, that's a sort of vital editorial support. And obviously, if you're writing a play, maybe it depends if you've got a director or you're doing something not to commission. If you're doing something to commission, so you're working for somebody who's probably going to direct it or be involved as an artistic director, you have a collaboration there, and I imagine that's highly valuable. But it is, you know, I always think it's a lonely old job being a writer.
Yeah, but that attracts a certain sort of person who doesn't mind that. I think that's normally the thing, isn't it? I think. I wanted to ask you very quickly something about talent, because it's a word that keeps coming up.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to... I read a very good book of interviews with Danny Boyle last week, which I enjoyed very much, whose pathway in to the theatre was that kind of old school ASM to what, you know, ASM first gig, which used to be how you got your equity card, and actually is still, I mean, I think by the time Danny Boyle was going, that, although Andy Serkis also stage manager in, so maybe they're about the same generation, I think, so maybe that was still a thing. Anyway, his line was, the first thing that matters is energy, and you discover a few years on whether you have talent, which I thought was a terrible, horrible gamble to take. But I thought that was interesting. And he talks about, you know, having left Bangor and gone and seen some joint stock in Mould when Clwyd opened up and just chucked himself at the wall. But I think that's the other thing, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it gives you confidence, maybe. I mean, I think he's probably being a bit self-deprecating.
I'm sure he was.
But having said that, unless you have a hunger and an enthusiasm, which which is combined with a sort of obsessive perfectionism and worrying that, to me, all great artists have. You know, there's very few great artists who are casual of any description. You know, that doesn't happen by accident, does it? So I think you could argue it either way. I think the confidence of throwing yourself into it, somebody giving you breaks, gives you the confidence to allow your talent to blossom. I would say it that way around. And everybody's unsure of themselves, or most decent people are unsure of themselves, aren't they? If you're not a politician.
Yeah, but sometimes, particularly in the world of an actor, there is that extraordinary difference between the public face, which I guess you help curate, and a private life, somebody like Tony Hancock. You know, the public face, but the private life is, as you say, full of uncertainties. You know, and
yeah, no, it does attract The way I like to think of it, or the way I put it, I think nearly all creative artists are quite complicated in one way or another.
Barney,
Not all.
that seems to be where you come in again.
Well, I don't know. No, I think, I think complicated, and then, and that's the game. But psychologically odd, really. I think that about acting. When you were talking about acting earlier, the other thing I always find so amazing about people who can last as actors is that they commit to never ever knowing more than 3 or 6 months in advance, which for most people is really, really impossible. You know, I deal with the anxieties that develop in me by building as much ahead as I can, so you stave off the threat of, you know, whatever. But actually, the whole point of acting is to wait for the gig and then jump. And that's an amazing psychological resilience as well. So there's this sort of extraordinary thing, which is also probably something you need to manage that side of your career, but also to be great on a stage, to be in the moment, to not be thinking about...
Yeah, there are so many good actors, aren't there? I mean, just amazing drama schools. It is a deeply insecure profession. You know, it's not, you don't get many Donald Sindens who I think had 3 weeks out of work in his career or something.
Great.
You know, but there are, you know, that is, and there are, I'm sure even Ian McKellen's was, I don't know what he was like in his 20s, but I'm sure it's tough. But it's easier doing your 20s because you got, on the whole, tend to have low overheads, and you can do the waiting job and you know, whatever it takes. But I think as you get older, it must be very challenging.
How does one manage that kind of tension between an actor or performer who wants to be out there a lot and is in danger of getting overexposed, sort of a la Jamie Oliver, compared to an actor or performer who sits there and says, you know, I'm waiting for the perfect opportunity, and it doesn't happen this year, it'll be next year. How do you sort of manage people at each ends of the spectrum?
I don't think many people can afford to do that at the back end.
At the beginning, so
you get, you know, to a degree, you've got to, you know, it's just practicalities here, and people have to eat, don't they? And you know, I think if you know, I've looked after Ryan Atkinson for 30 years plus, and he only works when he wants to work, but he can afford to work when he wants to work
now. But then,
for 20 years, yeah. But he works very hard when he works, and then he can quite capable of taking a year off.
Do you have to push him out of his tent occasionally with a project that you think he should do?
You try, but he's his own man in the end. Yeah, you can put the bread on the water.
But the Maigret, was that something?
Yeah, funny enough, what he did say, I'd love to play a television detective of some sort.
Oh, okay.
That's something I would like thought of. So I went to the BBC and ITV and I said, you've got a character that you think would suit him. And Peter Finch from ITV came back saying, well, actually, we've been pitched Maigret, but I didn't like the casting. But if you consider doing Maigret, then we'll do it.
Literally, he didn't have to go along and convince them. They said, right.
Yeah, I mean, it was a classic one though, because he was all set up, and then he wobbled for some reason and said, I'm not doing it. I remember I was having lunch. I tried to be in Oxford sometime on Friday in some pub the other side of Oxford called the Fish, I think it's called, in Cumberland or somewhere. And
the trout or the perch?
No, not the Fish. There's one called the Fishes.
Oh, the Fishes. Okay.
Okay. He thinks North Hinksey, somewhere like that. You know?
Oh, right.
And I remember getting the phone call saying, "I just don't want to ruin your week, but do you mind telling him I can't do Maigret?" You know, the whole thing was set to go. You know, and it's star power in a way, you know. But, you know, to be fair, ITV said, well, let's just wait for a year, see what he feels like next year. Stood it down, paid it off, and then did it, you know.
Really?
Yeah, and they did a couple of, you know, there's a number of episodes, not a huge amount, but it's something that he wanted to do. I think it was a bit old-fashioned in a way. Still had a polish to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a bit like Endeavour now, you know, the very... Well, it was a bit more, you know, I like Endeavour actually. Old Oxford in the 50s or whatever it is, 60s. And
they get these amazing casts.
Yeah. Well, Morse in its prime was as good as you get. I mean, that was fantastic. That's a fantastic example of great producing, great writing, great acting.
And music.
And music, making memorably good television. And that was, you know, it is every part of that equation. But one of the key things, they had top writers. playwrights often.
Right.
Minghella writing the first one, I think, was it.
That was it?
Minghella wrote the first ever. And then
Yeah, I'm
that
trying to-
continues throughout.
Yeah, yeah,
the
but
Disney
they always had, you know, people who would be able to get a play on, like, you
Yeah.
know, at the top theatre.
And directors as well.
Directors as well. Yeah, that was really well done. Yeah.
We should have the. I've recently bought the box set to sit down and see it all.
Yeah, I'm sure it stood the test of time.
And the casts are amazing, and so many of them went on to do things. We were obviously terribly sad to learn about Emma Chambers, and they put an episode of The Vicar of Dibley on literally the day after she died.
that, yeah.
And Camilla and I sat down and watched it, and it was very moving. But the cast was extraordinary, quite extraordinary. I mean, that must have been an amazing thing to be part of.
That was the most fun thing to be part of, I think, that I've been involved with. Partly because Richard Curtis is, you know, is a wonderful, wonderful man. And it was his baby, and it was. I had to fight a bit to get to produce it because he had this idea. He wanted to do something that was relevant at the time, and this was the time when women priests and the synod and these decisions were being made. So he said, let's do something that's actually topical, but can be very set in its effectively in Great Hazley, although we filmed it in Turville. But he lived then in Great Hazley outside. On the way to London there in Oxfordshire countryside. So he said, I'll use the characters from the village, but make it about something that's, you know, topical. And then Dawn it was not written for Dawn, actually. Dawn was cast.
Really? Can we know who it might have been written
Well,
for?
I think Miriam Margolyes was,
really?
no, it was cast. He wrote it and then said, let's see who should play it.
Right, yeah.
And Julie Walters, I think, was considered normal, you know, usual suspects in Dawn, but you'd have thought it was written for Dawn, wouldn't you?
You would.
But she made it her own anyway. I mean, but all those, and then that you know, and then he attracts talented people, and we had good directors, and we, you know, it was a really, really good, fun thing to be part of, really. And I think anybody who was part of it, and, you know, God rest her soul, Emma Chambers, but would have said that's as nice a thing as I ever did in my professional life.
And it also left people wanting more.
Yeah, there weren't a huge amount, and
12 episodes?
a bit more than that, a few more than that, because we did specials and this and that. There were probably 18 or something, probably around about there. But
that's not many.
And or maybe 20, but it's in that sort of area because we did them at 3s and 4s. I remember one funny anecdote. When you choose a location for a sitcom, you got, if you're out, you know, location rather than the studio, you've got to make sure that you don't alienate them. Because you'll need to, if it works, you want to go back. You know, it's a bit like I was involved with Bennett-Jones, you know, you need permissions, and if you piss them off, they remove your permissions, which happened. I had to bribe my way out of that one. But this we went round second. Seriously, I went to a meeting of the parish council. It was like a mirror of the programme to be able to pitch to come back. And there was a very austere, recently died, I think, a historian called Sir Alistair Horn, very distinguished historian, who lived in the old rectory. Well, the poor vicar lived in some prefab around the back in the village of Turville where we filmed it. And the meeting took place in his, you know, grand hall in his house, as it were, and we went in, and he said, we'll move you to the top of the agenda. And I said, okay, and I was there with my Sue Virtue, who now produces Sherlock, and married to Stephen Moffat, and she is a fantastic producer. And anyway, we were there singing for our supper, and I said, well, is there anything we can do to make your life better this time, you know, because we'd like to do that. And he said, well, you can put some bloody jokes in it this time.
What's the most unusual bribe you've had to offer as part of sort of easing the path of a production? That you can talk about, Peter, that you can talk about.
It was funny, the one in Bennett-Jones was told that, because we made a documentary about Bennett-Jones, the same as doing a series of Bennett-Jones, and Bennett-Jones is pretty rough, in all honesty. And it was a classic ITV, it's just doing its 10th series. And they would be irritated by this documentary because it showed some of the sort of people out on the razzle and how people behave badly. And the hotel owners where we were based and all the filming got to hear saying, you know, they've been slanging off Bennett-Jones while. So anyway, they stopped down, they went to the mayor and they stopped all filming. And Geoffrey Perkins, who was my colleague, brilliant former head of comedy at the BBC, wonderful, wonderful best comedy producer of all time in my book. And he's producing it, and he rings me up and says, we're knackered. He said they'll only get out of it if they see the boss. And he said, bring a few grand. He said, you never know. So I fly out, a day trip to Bennett-Jones. I get up at 6, go down there with all the bucket and spades, fly out there. We go and have a bit of a lunch. And I said, right, let's go and see these guys. And we go into this room, which was no windows, white sofas, and this sort of mini mafia, really. I did my apologies. I give them my card saying chairman and, this and that, and offer some PR and this. And I'm halfway through and I've got 5 grand in my back pocket, and I realised I could probably get away with 3. So, so I'm sitting there peeling notes off in the back of my pocket, and then I put out this wad. And so this might ease our negotiation. And it did, it worked.
It's a good calculation to be able to make.
No, that's very sharp thinking.
You've obviously said that TV is a difficult word, or a more challenging world compared to the theatre and publishing. What about film? Because obviously, film's a murky world, and it's not something that Barney's in yet, but I'm sure he will be one day. What are your feelings, thoughts, experiences?
Well, I think in a way I treat like film in Britain as like a cottage industry, whereas television and theatre, in many respects we're world leaders. I mean, also great television coming out of America in some respects, but there's a level of quality of work over the years of especially original drama, comedy, factual television, and I think in terms of novelists. Mm-hmm. And theatre, yeah. But when it comes to film, given how many films are made and how many you actually think that is fantastic, there are fewer films made obviously because you don't need to make a film. You have to make television. You've got to fill the airtime, whereas film is put together in a much more it's a more international game. And I was actually working this morning on trying to get an Armando Iannucci project financed, but he wants more money than it's probably worth in financing terms. That's a difficult negotiation, and they're blooming difficult things to get to happen. I think however bad a film is, if the producers got it to happen in the first place, they deserve a gold star for that. Because Billy Elliot's a good example. I was trying to get that financed. We had half the money from the BBC. It was a £2.8 million budget at the time. Working title had Stephen Daldry under contract, who was the director we wanted. We'd originally looked at it as a TV project, actually, and then they thought, well, this could be a film. Mm-hmm. And it was initiated by Lee Hall, and there was a little story that somebody read. He'd read in the papers about this ballet boy, etc. So, and in that instance, I tried to persuade them to come up with the other 1.4 million. They're owned by Universal Studios and all the rest of it, and Daldry was very persuasive. And I remember I went on my knees in the meeting. I said, please, it's not that much. I knew him pretty well. And the line was, when eventually they said, okay, we'll give you half, the other 1.4, which they then screwed us for all the rights and the stage rights, and the line going out the door was, you might just get away with it. And anyway, I, having set it up, I didn't have much to do with that. I don't take credit for the brilliance of the film, but wouldn't have happened if I hadn't gone down on my knees, I suspect.
Never have happened.
Yeah, and that was a classic example, because they said there was only 4 women, because the boy inevitably was not going to be famous.
Yeah.
They said the ballet, the mother or the ballet teacher, anyway, Julie Walters was, there was a choice, had to be, Emma Thompson, Julie Walters.
Helen Mirren or...
Yeah. And if you don't get that, no movie.
That's
so good old Julie Walters.
Good old Julie Walters. But that brings around to your long-term time involvement with the National Theatre. What have been the highlights of your time on the board and your involvement at the National Theatre? Because it's been a remarkable
Well,
period,
it's been a great institution to be part of. I mean, I think, there's can't be many, if any, places producing consistently high quality of new and classic work on a regular basis, year in and year out. You're not going to have a hit every time. bit of a mauling of Macbeth I saw this morning, but I was meant to see it last night, but I never got out of a room dealing with another charity crisis. But I think, you know, when Heitner was at his pomp, you know, that's as
Good as it goes.
good to get. I think there's so many brilliant productions that I've seen, you know, either involving him or not. I think Follies this last year was just stunning, just a stunning piece of work. And I think there's been a lot of very good work in named Dorfman. I think it's a very good plays. I loved Consent. I thought it was a very good play indeed. We're still trying to get that West End opening. The beginning was pretty good, you know. Lots of very good work and beautifully acted, beautifully directed, beautifully done. It's easier to do something, I think, in the smaller space than the big spaces, but they have their challenges. But my goodness me, I suppose partly because it's my taste in a way. My most memorable moment, I think, was not quite realising what I was going to see in the sake of One Man, Two Governors, and going to the opening night of that. And at the end they have a very, very funny sequence in the last 10 minutes of the first half with a waiter.
Yeah.
They had a fast director working with Nick on this, and it just was pitch perfect. And this old lady, I think, was a donor to the National, was on her own there in the first night thing. Quite, you know, quite delicate. And she grabbed hold of my arm very hard and said, "Oh, do help me. I think this might be too funny and I might die laughing." And that's a moment I always remember. And I said, well, she'll be writing another check. You know, and James Corden in his pomp, you know.
No, that was extraordinary. I particularly loved that extraordinary period of the shed with that sort of, it was like opening the back door of the theatre and a whole load of things came in that might have had to wait 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, new writing. It's a pity that's not there, you know, but the Dorfman now is only new writing, so that didn't used to be the case.
Yeah.
So, but that is an essential element because it's a very, you know, there are quite a few, not very many producing theatres. I'm involved with the Liverpool Everyman actually, and season started last night, where they have a company and they do some new work, doing a musical, Paint Your Wagon last night was a musical. So, but there aren't many West Yorkshire players, but new plays are, it's a tough environment for a new young playwright.
Most of them are dreadful. It's difficult, isn't it? There's a great proliferation of studio theatres, but the capacity to make a play of scale that didn't exist last week is vanishingly rare.
Yeah.
And a very lucky thing if you get to do it.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing to do. You know, there have been a couple of ones that haven't worked at the National in the last 12 months. You know, and it's very exposed. It's like doing a primetime show on BBC One. It's, you know, you're judged from the off, and you don't have any time to play around with it. You're there on the main screen, you know, and I think that's particularly with the Olivier Theatre, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it, putting new work straight onto the Olivier because it's got to be massive and there's huge expectations when you go in there. You walk into the shed with one set of expectations, but you go into the Olivier, which is kind of the crown jewels stage, and you've got your expectations.
Yeah, and I think a lot of very successful theatre has actually started with a studio base and built up in scale. I mean, Hamilton's probably a bit like that, isn't it? I'd have rather seen it.
That was a one-man show, I think, for the first few years.
Right, I wish I'd seen it in its first incarnation, actually, or earlier incarnation, because you feel it's now a bit glitzy and musically. I mean, it's great. But in Book of Mormon, they worked on for a long, long, long time, workshopping, experimenting.
Jerry Springer the Opera is a story I love as a BAC show that went to Edinburgh twice before anything. Really interesting, the growth of that.
So, it's, but there's an appetite, you know, and the great thing when something does take off or work, you know, it's a lovely thing to have created.